Hey, how's it going? I'm Seth from retipster.com, and in this video, I'm going to take you through something called a Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment. So what is a Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment? Some people call it a Phase 1 ESA for short. So this is a report that is very commonly ordered when people are buying commercial or industrial property. This is something that residential properties are exempt from. So when you're buying and selling a residential property, most people never do this kind of thing because there's no reason to. Whenever you're dealing with commercial property, there is potential liability on that property owner if that property is contaminated. Like if there was a gas station on the property in the past, or a dry cleaning facility that polluted the environment, or really anything that just dumped chemicals or carcinogens or something like that all over the property. Because these kind of contaminants can actually cause harm to the people in the property. Say if they're trying to use the groundwater, there can even be vapor issues where vapors come from the ground. And a lot of times, say if there is contamination and we can determine that it was caused by the previous owner, we can figure that out before we buy the property so that the previous owner has to clean it up. Or at the very least, we can establish that I, as the new buyer, am not the person who caused this contamination. It was here already when I bought the property. So if anybody ever discovers this in the future, we can establish that at this point in time, it was there already. I didn't do it. And this is what they call the all-appropriate inquiry. So a Phase 1 is like that first initial step where you hire an environmental consultant to go out and look at the property and look at a lot of public records and records of properties in the area, the adjoining properties, just to make sure that, when we visit the property, we don't see any obvious signs of contamination. And when we look at the historical records, nothing about this leads us to believe that this property has ever been contaminated in any way. And if a Phase 1 does not come back clean, then the next step is to get a Phase 2, and that's where they actually go out and do soil borings and they drill into the ground and pull out samples to see, is this contaminated? And if so, what kind of contamination is it? And what do we need to do to fix the problem or at least mitigate the situation? So that's kind of going beyond the scope of this video. In this video, I'm just going to show you what a Phase 1 is, why it's necessary, how to make sense of it. So with that all out of the way, I'm going to just start jumping into this thing. This Phase 1 report is 168 pages. So they're not short, but really a lot of the stuff in here, most people don't even look at. They're just looking for what are the findings? What actually is the situation? Are there issues or not? And when you're looking at a Phase 1 report, what you're looking for is called a REC, or REC, which stands for Recognized Environmental Condition. And RECs can be all kinds of different things. It could be, hey, I saw an empty barrel on the property, or there's a pile of dirt over here, and we don't know if that dirt is contaminated, or we weren't even able to look at some of the information, so we don't know. Maybe there's a big problem that we just couldn't account for, or maybe there's a pipe sticking out of the ground, things like that. So we're sort of trying to look at that to see, is there any reason that we need to go further into a Phase 2, or is this thing just totally clean? There's no issues or concerns. And if you want to just look for the findings and see what are the issues, you could go down here to the executive summary. And as you're going to notice, a lot of the stuff is like blacked out. That's to protect privacy and the parties involved and the address and all that stuff. But you would just go down here to executive summary, and it just tells you all the basic details about the property itself. And then if we keep scrolling down here, we're going to see on-site RECs, controlled RECs, or historical RECs, that kind of thing. As you can see, this just says none, none, none. And that's what you want to see. Like that's the perfect situation, because then you can just say, okay, we're done. Let's move on. Let's not spend any more time or money on environmental work. If there are RECs though, that's when you may have to go on and do a Phase 2 to resolve those issues and figure out, is it actually contaminated or are we fine? And then if it is contaminated, what next? But before we skip too far ahead, I'm going to just start up here at the top and go page by page and help you understand what parts of this report are pretty important and you want to pay attention to, and what parts of this report you can basically either ignore, or most people ignore it because it's not that critical, or it's just like boilerplate information. It's a very similar thing with commercial appraisals, where it's like this giant packet with just tons of information. And I remember looking at those things and thinking like, did somebody seriously write all this out just for this one property, or is a lot of this stuff just copy and paste? We're going to go through that right now. So this first page right here is basically just a letter explaining what you're about to see. This is a Phase 1 1 environmental site assessment, and it says who prepared the report. As you can see here, I worked with a company called Grand Environmental, and it's going to explain that it's going by the ASTM standard. And that's another thing about these reports, is that there are a ton of these acronyms buried in here, or industry lingo that no normal person should understand or know about. But if you're an environmental consultant or in the banking industry or something like that, you're probably going to be at least somewhat familiar with what these things mean. So ASTM stands for American Society for Testing and Materials, with this number on it, which basically just indicates what the standards are and when it was last revised. That's what that -13 means, is it was last revised in 2013, so that we understand what we're measuring this against. It's that particular standard. Just kind of read a lot of this. A lot of this stuff is boilerplate, I think, where they just fill in specific details about the property in question. Then we go down here. This is like the cover page. It says when it was completed. Table of contents. So the ASTM standard does actually have like a suggested flow of information, and I believe that's what this is following. And it's really just explaining where you can find everything in the report, everything from what they reviewed to their findings and all of their source documentation that they use to get this information. So that's what that's all about. And then here, as I mentioned just a minute ago, this is the executive summary. So a lot of people will just zoom right to this just to see, okay, what do I need to know? What's important? What are the findings? And as we keep going down here, so this shows the historical use. As you can see, this was agricultural land. And then at one point there was like a small mobile home that they saw from the old aerial photos years ago, which I can show you later on. And then it was just vacant land. So this is a pretty simple property, but sometimes you'll find properties where, you know, this was a industrial facility and then it was torn down and something else was built there. And then that was torn down and something else was built there. So if it is a more complicated property, you can see a lot more information here, and these reports can be a lot longer. It also shows the adjacent property uses. As you can see, it points out how there's 2 gas stations right nearby. So anyway, so we keep going down. So no wrecks, no controlled wrecks, and then exceptions and significant assumptions. So this kind of spells out if there was any big or even small pieces of information that we would normally be looking for that we couldn't find and couldn't account for. This is what they are. So for example, one standard thing that they will look at is like the title history of the property to see who owned it, or like aerial photos or past uses and that kind of thing. And if they just flat out couldn't find that information, they're going to put that here, and they'll call it a data failure because they couldn't get the information. So something could have happened there that they didn't know about. And also even things like if there's overgrown vegetation so they couldn't see the floor or the ground of the property, or like if there was 5 feet of snow or something like that, there could have been a barrel sitting under that snow that they couldn't see. So they would have to put that in here, basically saying like, we couldn't see this. So that's one exception, or that's one assumption, was that nothing was there. If we keep moving on here. So this is kind of the beginning where they just have an introduction where they sort of explain what's going on, who's doing it, why they're doing it, the property. A lot of this stuff is boilerplate information, so it's not a whole lot of unique stuff here. Where they probably like just insert specific variables like the property address or parcel number. And then they sort of state those limitations and exceptions again. If we keep scrolling down here, data gaps. So this explains again what those data gaps were. It kind of just goes more in depth from that exceptions and assumptions section I was showing you earlier. And then special terms and conditions. So the environmental company, Grand Environmental, made no attempt to independently verify the accuracy or completeness of information. So they're kind of just taking what they found and assuming that it's correct, which is pretty normal. And then user reliance. So this is basically spelling out who is this report for and who can rely on it for like a liability protection. This is actually pretty important because you want to have those appropriate parties listed here. Like you want to have the actual owner entity here. So my LLC name that owns the property was listed there. And I did not use financing for this, but if I did, that bank would want to have their name here. If the SBA was used for this, the SBA would want their name in here. So basically everybody who needs to be protected should have their name included in this user reliance section, because if it's not, then the liability could fall on their shoulders at some point. So just keep that in mind. Say if you buy a property and then you quickly transfer it to another entity that you also own, you would want to make sure that that next entity is included in this user reliance section. And then if we keep moving down here, This just spells out pretty clear description of the property, like the legal description, parcel address, parcel ID number, the characteristics of the site. This user provided information. So there's a number of things that I had to provide to the environmental consultant so they could do these extra parts of the research. Some of it also came from the current owner of the property or the seller. One of those things was the title search or the title records. I basically gave them a copy of the preliminary title report, which doesn't provide a whole lot of information, but it does show like there's this easement or this lien on the property and that kind of thing. And really what they're looking for there is, are there any of those liens or easements or anything that would cause an environmental concern? Like, is there an oil and gas lease on the property where, who knows, maybe they drilled on the property at some point and that created an environmental issue. So if they do see that kind of stuff, then they'll dig a little bit deeper to find out what did happen there. So that's kind of what they're looking for there. Just kind of explains some of the limitations as well, things that they can't really research. And as we keep moving down here, so they also did a questionnaire that I had to answer and also the current owner had to answer. So they kind of mentioned some of that stuff here as well, where they say the user representative did not maintain any specialized knowledge regarding the subject property. So basically, you know, the question they asked me and the seller, we didn't have any issues to point out really in terms of what the property was currently being used for or past uses and past known uses of the property. And then it kind of explains what the intended use of the property is. And sometimes that can be an issue, say, if the intended use is going to be something that will be an issue with the known wrecks on the property. But again, that's not really an issue here at all because there were no wrecks. Moving on here. So records review. So this is where they start looking at a lot of government managed databases and other things like that that point out potential recognized environmental conditions. So we scroll down here. So this right here, this table is showing a federal database of all these different sites with known environmental issues that are within a half-mile or mile radius around the property. All these oddball names here are, for example, like a state landfill or a hazardous waste site or national priority list. So this is like, I believe it's like a list of sites with known contamination and past issues. And the reason this might be relevant is because sometimes these contamination issues can affect a lot of the properties around it. Say, for example, if a chemical plant blows up and stuff flies all over the place, or if there is a site with issues up at the top of a hill, but because it's at the top of the hill, that over time migrates down the hill and affects all the properties near it. So that's what this is all about. As you can see, for the most part, there isn't anything, but they did find some issues within a half-mile radius, which we'll get into more as we move down here. So first of all, the subject property status, this is just talking about the property that I'm buying and how that particular property does not have any issues with it. And then as we go down here to the remaining property status, so this is where it starts talking about the adjoining properties and these other properties that may present issues. This first one right here is the site identified adjacent to the west of the subject property. And when you see stuff like BEA, UST, and LUST, BEA stands for Baseline Environmental Assessment, which is basically the assessment that you do when there's significant environmental contamination on a property, and you kind of figure out, okay, what are the next steps? Or can we just buy the property and not do anything to it, knowing that there is contamination as long as we follow a certain due care plan to mitigate that contamination. Then UST stands for underground storage tank, and LUST, that stands for leaking underground storage tank, which is something that, as you can imagine, happens at old gas stations and that kind of thing. So basically those things were identified on the adjacent property. And this basically explains the research they did on that particular property and what they found and whether or not it affects the subject property. And as you can see down here, it says, based on the information reviewed and the known groundwater flow direction away from the subject property, this site is not likely to impact the subject property. So note that they're not saying that it didn't impact. It said it's not likely to impact. The only way they could say for sure if it did impact it would be to do a phase 2, where they literally test the soil to verify is there contamination. And again, that's not what we're doing here with a phase 1. However, this does meet the standard for all appropriate inquiry. So as long as they're looking into it sufficiently and they're making pretty reasonable reasonable conclusions about, we looked at all these things. We don't think it's a problem because of these reasons. That's good enough. And that's enough research to give me the protection that if they ever do find contamination in the future, it's still not my fault because we looked into it sufficiently at this point in time. So that's kind of what a phase one does for you. Moving on here. So we've got another site adjacent to the southwest of the subject property with similar stuff because it's also a gas station. And again, they're saying that based on Grand's review of the file, the closed status of the site and topography of the site is not likely to impact the subject property. So even though there is a site with potential issues, it's not a problem for this property. And then down here, so this is talking about another site approximately 1,700 feet northwest of the subject property. And this was basically a tire dump. And back in 1987, a whole lot of tires were consumed in a fire. And that definitely created a big environmental issue back then. And because it's within a relatively close range of this property, they had to look at that and make sure, is there any reason to think that would have contaminated this property? You can see all the stuff they found, a lot of acronyms and confusing stuff in there. Based on the file reviews, topography, and approved project completion, it would not be likely for this site to impact the subject property. And then based on the site status, the information, all this stuff, none of the remaining sites would be considered evidence of a wreck. So that's good. That's what we want to see. And the next step, we have these unmappable orphan sites. So what that means is that there were sites with issues, like Spill's site that is located on the west side of, there were other sites indicated in the database report listed above there, but for whatever reason, we're not really sure why, the database is unable to map some of those sites required in the report. So they have to then dig a little deeper to figure out, okay, what are these sites and are they a problem? So that's what they're talking about here. And, accordingly, this site is not likely to impact the subject property. So there you go. Additional environmental report sources. So they can also talk to the local fire department. Sometimes they will have records of any potential issues that may not show up in other databases. So they check with those local records as well. Also the local health department. So sometimes you'll find that, a certain database has the information and another database does not. That's what that's all about. And then moving on here, local utility companies. So this subject property doesn't currently have any connections to utilities. And then previous environmental reports. So, if you've got a property that has been commercial for a long time and there's been a lot of other transactions and everybody's done environmental work from one transfer to another, you can usually get that stuff and review that and see if there's any other issues mentioned there. But again, this is a little bit different because this is a residential property. Residential properties are exempt from this kind of thing. So there's really no logical reason why any previous owner would have gotten a phase one because they were keeping it residential. But because I'm changing it to commercial, that's why I'm doing this. And that's why I'm the first person in the chain of title to do that. Moving on here, physical setting sources. So this is explaining some of the maps and topographic maps that they used to do a lot of this research, which is at the end of this report, which we'll get to in a minute. Historical use information on the property. So this is just explaining what the historical uses were and during which time ranges. And then assessor records. So this is kind of just restating stuff that's already been talked about. Fire insurance, maps, aerial photographs. Again, just explaining what maps and data they looked at when evaluating this property. This also shows some of the past uses of the property based on when these aerial photos were taken. And it's just saying, this is what the land appeared to be used for, agricultural. And at one point, there was a small mobile home on the property, but really nothing that would cause any major concern. It's not like they saw a gas station back in the 50s when it was very common for gas stations to just leak all over the place because nobody cared back then. But this just outlines what the historical uses were based on those aerial photographs. You can see a lot of that stuff here. And historical city directories. This gives more information about the subject property and the adjoining property uses back in time. And historical topographic maps, more of the same stuff here. So site reconnaissance, this explains how the environmental consultant went out and visited the property. So they actually put eyes on it and saw it themselves. That's something that they have to do with a phase one. And it kind of explains what she saw and what the conditions were like. In this case, there was some snow cover on the property, which is not the most ideal. It doesn't necessarily automatically ruin anything, but just means they can't see the ground as clearly as if there was not snow on it. It actually made me wonder, for properties in Alaska or northern Michigan or northern Minnesota, places where there's like several feet of snowfall, I don't know what they do there. If they just can't do these things in the winter or what. But anyway, that can be an issue if there's so much snow they can't see the ground. But that was not the case here. Just kind of explains what happened and what she saw. And again, just more narrative on that and the things that came up there. And this part right here, suspect PCB containing equipment. So PCB, I actually had to ask about this because I wasn't sure what that meant, but that's basically a type of fluid that is used in transformers, capacitors, elevators, any kind of hydraulic lift that is a contaminant. So if you did have a property that did have those kinds of features in it, you would want to look at that. Again, this is really simple because this is a vacant lot, so nothing going on there. Transformers, so there's no transformers on this property. Not the cars and trucks that turn into robots, but the electrical utilities. And then underground storage tanks. If there was evidence of an underground storage tank, say if there was like a pipe sticking up out of the ground or a drain cover or something like that, that would obviously be a red flag that they would have to look into. No above ground storage tanks were seen. Those are usually a lot easier because they're above ground. You can see them pretty clearly, but that was not there. No other evidence of chemical storage or anything like that. No other concerns. So move on down here. So this is just explaining the interview that was done with the seller of the property. In this case, the seller's realtor actually stepped in and did the interview so that the seller didn't have to. I don't think that's normal, but that was the case in this situation. So the whole questionnaire and interview was done with the realtor. And the realtor actually, as it was explained to me, the realtor was actually very, very familiar with the property. He was like a close family friend of the seller, so he had a lot of information that a typical realtor probably would not have. But anyway, so in this case, the realtor did it. And there were no occupants on the property. And they talked to the township officials and the county health department and got all the information that they needed to from them. And there were no issues that came up there. Now, findings 7.0. So this is one of those like super important parts of the report that people just zoom to this and skip a lot of the stuff I just showed you. Because this is really what we're after, is what was found on the property. What are the opinions? What are the conclusions? Are there wrecks on the property or not? If there are wrecks, what are they and why are those considered wrecks? And if there's not wrecks on the property, why not? Why were those other issues not considered recognized environmental conditions? So as we go down here, we can see what they found. There was the historical presence of a trailer on the property and the presence of these issues on these other sites were identified. So those were like the biggest, I guess, red flags that they were able to find. Just kind of explains stuff that was already explained earlier on, but it just sort of summarizes it, that of these things they found, they didn't think that they were considered recognized environmental conditions because there was no direct evidence that those things had a negative impact on the subject property. And then conclusions, it just says flat out, the ESA or the Environmental Site Assessment has revealed no evidence of wrecks in connection with the subject property. So that sentence right there is what you want to see. That's good news. As we go on down here, deviations just explains that they did not deviate from the ASTM standards, and if they did for some reason, they would want to spell that out. And there were no non-scope considerations included here. And then references, this lists out all the sources that they used to prepare this report and the conclusions that they found, and then the signatures of both of the environmental consultants involved. So that's pretty much all the stuff that matters the most, but you'll notice that we're only at page 27 here, and it goes on until 168 pages. So there's a whole lot of other information here. What is this? And is it important? Most people, I don't think, really look at this at all unless they're just curious about something. But the reason why a person might look at this is, say, if there was a recognized environmental concern identified and they want to understand more about why did they think that? What information were they looking at to make that conclusion? Really what this does is it just lists out all the information that they use. So in the preparation of this report, they used a lot of topographic maps and survey information and GIS data and that kind of thing. So it just shows what they used. So this is one topographic map where it points out the subject property and where it is in relation to everything else. This is a survey of the property. And then we've got another map of the property and we can see where the gas station is and the other gas station. And as we go down here, so this is one of the environmental consultants' resume, just kind of explaining, I know what I'm talking about. I am a certified licensed person to do this. I'm legit. Here's all my information. And then here's the exact same thing for the other person who did a lot of the information. In this case, Jane, I believe, did most of the work, and then Christy reviewed all that work. So it's not just one person's opinion. There's a couple people involved, and they agreed on everything. And then these are the pictures that were taken of the property when they did the site visit. So you can kind of see what it looked like and what they saw. And then a lot of information was pulled from the public records. So it's showing that actual information that they pulled, and a lot of emails and requests that went out to different government officials and what they were given back. It's kind of interesting, actually. You can see some really old pictures in some of these reports. And then here we've got the preliminary title report that they used to look at the title history. So that's included here as well. What else do we have here? So this is the questionnaire that both I and the seller's agent filled out. Got that information here. And then we've got this ERIS database report. So ERIS stands for Environmental Risk Information Services, and they can provide a lot of this stuff. And it explains a whole lot of information. I don't know why anybody would read through this stuff for fun, but it is at least somewhat relevant to the site and how they came up with their conclusions here. Here's another map of the property with the radiuses showing the other sites that showed up within a half mile to a mile around the subject property. You can see the 2 gas stations right there. I think one of these 2 is that tire plant that caught on fire. Anyway, it just shows where those things are in relation to the subject property. And if we keep going here, a lot of historical maps here. I always find this kind of interesting just because they go back so far. And this satellite map's from 2018. This one's from 2016. And this one's from 2014. This one's from 2012. This one's from 2010. This one's from 2009. This one's from 2006. This one's from 2005. It's kind of interesting to see this section up here because currently it's like fairly dense woods. If we go up here and see the present day map, you can see it's pretty densely wooded in there. And you can see, it looked pretty different. I wonder what was going on back then. Like, was that an orchard at some point? And that's actually one of the reasons why they look at these historical maps, because you can see what the property may have been used for back then. Orchards, for example, they used to dump just these horrible chemicals, which I don't know if they just didn't realize back then how poisonous it was, but whenever you see orchards from a long time ago, that's a huge red flag that you want to look into further. In this case, it was not an orchard. It was just a regular agricultural operation. You can see, like, this is going back to 1998 now, and it looks way different. Now, this one is jumping way back to 1981. You can see pretty clearly there's some kind of farming operation going on there. This is back in 1976. This is back in 1972. This is back in 1969, 1953 right here, and then 1938. That's the earliest aerial photo we have. It's just kind of interesting every time I see these to see like how an area changes over time. How at one point this was just considered way out in the sticks. Nobody lived out here, and now that's just changed a lot, and it will continue to change. So as we keep scrolling down here, just a lot more basic information, stuff that for the most part nobody cares about unless there's some significant issue. We get the seller questionnaire here, and that's it. That's the entire report. So that is a phase 1 environmental report, and that's how you can make sense of it for the most part. And again, this was like a super clean, pretty ideal outcome. They're definitely not always this way. Sometimes phase 1s will come back and just be a complete mess, and you have to go on and get a phase 2, which can range in cost. It obviously depends on where you are, but I've been told prices anywhere from $1,500 at the very low end up to like $7,000 for a phase 2, because there's a lot more hands-on work and testing involved. And of course, a phase 2 may not be the end of it either. If it comes back contaminated, there's a whole other set of steps you got to go through. So I hope you don't have to do that. I hope you get a phase 1 that's like this and it's just clean. And if it's not, I wish you all the best with getting those issues sorted out. So thanks for watching. If you are in the Michigan market, Grand Environmental is a great outfit to work with. Feel free to give them a call. And if you're in some other state, I wish you all the best in finding a great company that can help you get this done. Thanks. See ya.